There's a specific kind of suffering that happens when someone doesn't choose you. You know this pain, the replaying of conversations, the questions that circle endlessly, the quiet wondering what you did wrong. And beneath it all, the ache that won't quite leave. Why wasn't I enough? Here's what most people miss. If someone doesn't choose you and you stay anyway, hoping, waiting, trying to earn what should be freely given, the suffering isn't coming from them anymore. It's coming from you. Not because you're broken or weak, but because you're doing something the Buddha warned against 25 centuries ago. He called it attachment. Not love, attachment. The quiet force that keeps you reaching for what's already gone, that turns care into craving, that makes you negotiate with reality instead of seeing it clearly. And here's the compassionate truth. You weren't taught how to recognize this. No one showed you the difference between loving someone and clinging to them. You're suffering not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something human, something every person does until they learn another way. Tonight, 11 authentic Buddhist stories that reveal exactly what attachment is, where it comes from, and how it finally releases. Not harsh lessons, but mirrors, encounters with this same pain and the wisdom that transformed it. If it feels right, share where you're listening from below. The first teaching begins now. When someone doesn't choose you, your mind does something automatic. It starts searching. You replay the last conversation, looking for the moment things shifted. You analyze text messages for hidden meanings. You wonder if you said too much or not enough, if you were too available or not present enough, if you gave too much or held back too long. The questions multiply faster than you can answer them, and beneath every question sits one deeper ache. What's wrong with me? This isn't overthinking. This is suffering, trying to understand itself. And here's what makes it so exhausting. You're not just hurting from their absence. You're hurting from the story your mind is building about what their absence means. 25 centuries ago, a monk named Vakali understood this suffering in a way that might surprise you. Vakali wasn't rejected by a romantic partner. He wasn't passed over for a position or abandoned by a friend. Vakali's attachment was to someone who actually cared for him deeply, the Buddha himself. Vakali had become a monk for one reason. He found the Buddha's physical presence so compelling that he couldn't bear to be away from it. The way the Buddha moved, the calm in his face, the grace in his gestures, Vakali was transfixed. He would position himself where he could watch the Buddha throughout the day. He memorized every detail of the Buddha's appearance. His entire practice became about proximity to this one person. The other monks noticed. They saw how Vakali barely meditated. rarely studied, hardly engaged with the teachings. He was physically present in the monastery, but mentally consumed with watching, waiting, making sure he could see the Buddha as much as possible. Then something shifted. The Buddha began spending more time in solitude, teaching smaller groups, traveling to remote areas. Vakali's access to him diminished. And as it did, Vakali became ill. Not with a disease you could diagnose. His body grew weak from an ache that had no physical source. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't find peace anywhere. The monastery's physicians examined him and found nothing wrong, yet Vakali continued to deteriorate. He withdrew to a small dwelling on Vulture Peak, too sick to function, too consumed with longing to recover. When word reached the Buddha that Vakali was dying, he went to see him. Imagine that moment. Vakali, wasted from months of suffering, suddenly seeing the person he'd been craving standing in his doorway. The relief must have been overwhelming. Finally, after all that absence, here was the presence he needed. But what the Buddha said next changed everything Vakali understood about his suffering. Vakali, what is there to see in this foul body? The Buddha's voice was gentle but direct. This body is subject to decay, to death, to dissolution. Why do you waste your energy clinging to it? Then he said the words that would become one of Buddhism's most important teachings. One who sees the Dhamma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dhamma. Vakali had been suffering not because the Buddha was absent, but because he was clinging to the wrong thing. He thought he needed the Buddha's physical presence. He thought his peace depended on being near this person, on seeing him, on having access to him. But the Buddha was pointing to something Vakali had missed entirely. What he actually needed wasn't a person, it was understanding. The teaching wasn't in the Buddha's face or form. It was in the truth the Buddha embodied, the wisdom he taught, the way of seeing reality clearly that he demonstrated. All of that was available to Vakali, whether the Buddha was physically present or not. But Vakali had made the Buddha into something he needed in order to be okay. And that need, that insistence that his well-being depended on someone else's proximity, was creating his suffering. This is where the Buddha's teaching on dukkha becomes painfully clear. Dukkha is the Pali word, usually translated as suffering, but it means something more specific than just pain. It's the friction that arises when you insist reality be different from what it is. When someone doesn't choose you, there's pain. That's natural. Loss hurts. Rejection stings. Loneliness aches. These are unavoidable parts of being human, of caring about connection in a world where nothing stays the same. But suffering, dukkha, is what happens when you take that natural pain and add insistence to it. You insist they should have chosen you. You insist the connection should have lasted. You insist that their absence means something terrible about your worth. You insist that you can't be okay without them, that your peace depends on them returning, that life won't make sense until they see your value. Every insistence creates friction. Every should rubs against what is. And that friction, that constant mental argument with reality, is where suffering multiplies far beyond the original pain. Vakali's body was healthy. The Buddha still existed in the world. The teachings were still available. But Vakali had convinced himself that none of that mattered if he couldn't have the Buddha in the specific way he wanted. The suffering wasn't coming from the Buddha's absence. It was coming from Vakali's relationship to that absence. This is the part most people miss when they're not chosen. You think the pain is about them, their decision, their absence, their apparent indifference. And yes, there's real pain in not being chosen. That pain is valid. It's human. It matters. But the suffering that keeps you up at night, that makes you check your phone compulsively, that has you rehearsing conversations and analyzing every interaction that's not coming from them anymore. That's coming from what your mind is doing with their absence. Your mind is doing what Vakali's mind did. It's taking a person and turning them into a condition for your peace. It's insisting that you can't be okay without them choosing you. It's making their decision into a verdict about your worth, rather than information about compatibility, timing, or their own capacity. The Buddha told Vakali something crucial. This body is subject to decay, to death, to dissolution. He wasn't being morbid. He was pointing to impermanence, the truth that everything changes, including people, including feelings, including circumstances. When you make your peace dependent on something impermanent, someone's feelings, someone's choice, someone's presence, you're building on unstable ground. Not because the person is bad, or because caring is wrong, but because impermanence is the nature of all conditioned things. People change their minds, feelings shift, circumstances evolve. What felt certain becomes uncertain. What felt permanent reveals itself as temporary. None of this is personal. None of this is punishment. This is just how reality works. But when you don't understand this, when you take impermanence personally, it feels like something is wrong with you. Vakali thought something was wrong with him when the Buddha spent less time visible to the monks. He didn't understand that the Buddha was simply doing what the Buddha needed to do, teaching, practicing, responding to circumstances as they arose. The Buddha's schedule had nothing to do with Vakali's worth, but Vakali had made it about his worth. He'd made the Buddha's presence into proof that he mattered, and the Buddha's absence into evidence that he didn't. You might be doing the same thing right now. Someone's decision not to choose you might have nothing to do with your value and everything to do with where they are, what they're capable of, what they're seeing or not seeing in their own life. But your mind takes their decision and turns it into a story about what's wrong with you. The Buddha's response to Vakali wasn't to convince him that he was worthy of being watched. It wasn't to spend more time with him or validate his need for proximity. The Buddha's response was to point Vakali toward a different relationship with presence and absence altogether. One who sees the Dharma sees me. What the Buddha was offering wasn't more access to his physical form. He was offering something that couldn't be taken away by distance or time, or changing circumstances. He was offering understanding. Understanding doesn't require someone else's cooperation. Understanding doesn't disappear when someone walks away. Understanding doesn't depend on being chosen, validated, or confirmed by another person. Understanding is what remains when everything else becomes impermanent. And what Vakali needed to understand was simple but profound. His suffering wasn't being created by the Buddha's absence. His suffering was being created by his insistence that the Buddha's presence was necessary for his peace. The moment Vakali heard those words, "One who sees the Dhamma sees me," something shifted. The teaching says that he immediately understood, not gradually, not over time, but in that instant. He saw what he'd been doing, mistaking the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself, mistaking the person teaching truth for truth itself, mistaking proximity to the Buddha for the peace the Buddha was pointing toward. And in seeing this clearly, his suffering ended. Not because the Buddha promised to be more available, not because Vakali's circumstances changed, but because Vakali stopped arguing with reality. He stopped insisting that his peace required the Buddha's physical presence. He stopped making the Buddha responsible for his inner state. He stopped demanding that impermanent things remain permanent. This is what the Buddha meant by the first noble truth, the truth of suffering's existence. Suffering exists not because life is unfair, or because people are cruel, or because you're not good enough to be chosen. Suffering exists because human beings have a tendency to cling to what's impermanent, to demand that changing things stay fixed, to make their peace conditional on circumstances they can't control. When someone doesn't choose you, the pain of that is real. You don't need to deny it or transcend it or spiritually bypass it. But the suffering that compounds that pain, the endless questioning, the self-blame, the desperate analyzing, the insistence that you can't be okay until they change their mind, that suffering is optional. Not easy to release, but optional. It's optional because it's being created by something you're doing internally, not by what they did externally. You're doing what Vakali did, taking a person and making them into a requirement for your peace. Taking their choice and turning it into a commentary on your worth. Taking impermanence and treating it like permanence should have been possible if only you'd been enough. The teaching here isn't that you should stop caring. It's not that connection doesn't matter or that loss shouldn't hurt. The teaching is that suffering intensifies when you mistake a person for your peace, when you confuse being chosen with being whole, when you make someone else responsible for your relationship with yourself. Vakali recovered, not because the Buddha started spending more time with him, but because he stopped needing the Buddha to be different than he was. He learned to access the teaching without requiring the teacher's constant physical presence. He learned to find peace that didn't depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. He learned the difference between appreciating someone and clinging to them. And in learning that difference, he discovered something unexpected: freedom. Not freedom from caring about the Buddha, but freedom from suffering over the Buddha's absence. Not freedom from wanting connection, but freedom from making connection a condition for inner peace. This is where the path begins, not in being chosen, but in understanding why not being chosen creates the specific suffering you're experiencing. Because once you understand the mechanics of your suffering, once you see what your mind is actually doing, that creates this friction, you have a choice you didn't have before. You can keep insisting reality be different, or you can start learning to meet reality as it is. One path leads to more suffering. The other leads somewhere unexpected. But first, you need to understand what attachment actually is and why the Buddha warned against it so strongly. Most people think attachment is love taken to an extreme. They think, I love this person so much that I've become attached. I care so deeply that I can't let go. My feelings are so strong that I'm suffering when they're not here. But Buddhism makes a distinction that changes everything. Attachment isn't love grown too large. Attachment is something else entirely. Something that often disguises itself as love, but operates by completely different principles. The Buddha had a half-brother named Nanda, who learned this distinction in a way he never expected. Nanda was engaged to be married to a woman named Janapada Kalyani, who was considered the most beautiful woman in the region. Nanda was deeply in love with her, or so he thought. When the Buddha returned to his home kingdom after his enlightenment, Nanda felt pulled to become a monk. Not from genuine spiritual calling, but from family pressure and social expectation. The Buddha was his half-brother, after all, and there was honor in following him. So Nanda ordained. He put on the robes, shaved his head, joined the monastery, and immediately became miserable. While the other monks meditated Nanda stared into space, thinking about Janapada Kalyani. While they studied the teachings, he replayed memories of her voice, her smile, the way she moved. While they practiced mindfulness, his mind was entirely consumed with images of her face. He couldn't eat properly because longing sat heavy in his stomach. He couldn't sleep because desire kept him awake at night. He couldn't focus on anything except the aching absence of the woman he'd left behind. The other monks noticed. They saw him performing his duties mechanically, while his mind was clearly elsewhere. They heard him sigh at random moments throughout the day. They watched him grow thin and withdrawn, going through the motions of monastic life while suffering intensely inside. One day, Nanda made a decision. He would leave the monastery and return to her. The teachings didn't matter if he couldn't have her. Enlightenment meant nothing compared to being with her again. He'd tried the spiritual path and found it empty because it didn't contain the one thing he needed, her presence. He was packing his belongings when the Buddha appeared at his door. "Come walk with me," the Buddha said simply. Nanda followed, assuming the Buddha would give him a lecture about commitment or discipline or the importance of the spiritual path. Instead, the Buddha took him to a remote hillside where they sat together in silence for a while. Then the Buddha asked a strange question. "Nanda, when you think of Janapada Kalyani, what do you see?" Nanda described her in detail. Her beauty, her grace, the way being near her made everything else fade away. The Buddha listened without judgment, then said, "I want to show you something." What happened next, the ancient texts tell us, was extraordinary. The Buddha used his meditative powers to give Nanda a vision of the celestial realms where beings called Devas lived. And in these realms, Nanda saw celestial nymphs, beings of such stunning beauty that Janapada Kalyani, by comparison, looked like a burned old monkey next to a young woman. The vision was so vivid, so overwhelming, that Nanda's entire orientation shifted instantly. Suddenly, his obsession with Janapada Kalyani seemed absurd. How could he have been so consumed with longing for her when beings of such incomparable beauty existed? His craving didn't disappear. It simply transferred to a new object. "If you practice diligently," the Buddha told him, "you can be reborn among these celestial beings and have 500 of these nymphs as your companions." Nanda was elated. He threw himself into practice with intense energy, but for entirely the wrong reason. He wasn't seeking understanding or liberation. He was seeking celestial nymphs. His craving had simply found a new, supposedly superior target. The other monks noticed the change in his effort and asked what had motivated him. When Nanda admitted he was practicing to gain access to celestial nymphs, they mocked him mercilessly. They called him a prostitute's wage worker, someone practicing the Dharma for the sake of sensual pleasure. Nanda was humiliated, but more than that, something in their mockery cracked open a question he hadn't been willing to ask himself. What was he actually doing? He'd been suffering over Janapada Kalyani, convinced that his peace depended on being with her. Then, shown something more beautiful, he'd immediately abandoned that craving for a new one. And now he was suffering again, this time from shame and from longing for beings he'd never even meet. The object kept changing, but the suffering remained constant. The Buddha, seeing that Nanda was finally ready, showed him one more vision. This time, not celestial realms, but hell realms. And in these realms of suffering, Nanda saw a massive cauldron being prepared. When he asked what it was for, the beings there told him, "This is being prepared for the monk, Nanda, the Buddha's brother, who is practicing to gain celestial nymphs. When his merit runs out, and he falls from the celestial realm, he will be cooked here for eons." The terror was visceral and immediate. But beneath the fear was something more important, a sudden, clear seeing. Nanda finally understood what the Buddha had been trying to show him all along. The problem wasn't Janapada Kalyani. The problem wasn't the celestial nymphs. The problem wasn't even the hell realms threatening him. The problem was craving itself. Tanha, in Pali, the relentless thirst that kept demanding reality be different, that kept insisting happiness lived somewhere other than here, that kept making peace conditional on obtaining or avoiding something. Whether he craved his former fiancée, or celestial beings, or escape from hell, didn't matter. Craving, in any form, created the same result: suffering. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught the second noble truth. The origin of suffering is craving. Not desire itself, but a specific kind of desire, the kind that says, "I cannot be at peace without this," or "I cannot tolerate that." Craving has three forms, the Buddha taught. There's craving for sensual pleasure, the kind Nanda felt for Janapada Kalyani, and then for the celestial nymphs. There's craving for existence, the desperate need to be someone, to matter, to be seen and chosen and validated. And there's craving for non-existence, the wish to escape, to disappear, to not have to feel what you're feeling. All three operate the same way. They turn your peace into a transaction. They say, you can only be okay if you get this thing, or if you become this person, or if this situation finally ends. And because reality is impermanent and uncontrollable, that transaction sets you up for endless suffering. When someone doesn't choose you, craving disguises itself as reasonable thinking. It sounds like, of course, I'm suffering. They didn't choose me. Anyone would feel this way. This is a natural response to loss. And yes, pain is natural. Disappointment is human. Sadness is a valid response to not getting what you wanted. But craving adds something extra. It adds the insistence that you cannot possibly be okay without being chosen. It adds the conviction that your worth is determined by their decision. It adds the belief that peace is impossible until they change their mind, or until you find someone else, or until enough time passes that you finally stop caring. Craving takes a moment of pain and turns it into an identity. You become the person who wasn't chosen instead of a person experiencing the pain of not being chosen right now. You make their decision into evidence about your fundamental value instead of information about this particular situation at this particular time. And once you've done that, you're trapped. Because now you're not just dealing with the original pain, you're dealing with all the mental proliferation that craving creates. The endless analysis, the self-blame, the comparison to others who were chosen, the desperate strategizing about how to become more acceptable, the bitter narrative about how you always end up in this position. This is what Nanda finally saw. His suffering over Janapada Kalyani wasn't because she was uniquely special, or because their connection was so profound that living without it was impossible. His suffering was because he'd made his peace conditional on having her, and when that condition couldn't be met, his mind created elaborate justifications for why he should continue suffering. When the Buddha showed him the celestial nymphs, Nanda's craving immediately transferred. He didn't need time to process or grieve or work through his feelings for Janapada Kalyani. The moment a more attractive option appeared, his supposed deep love vanished and reformed around a new object. This revealed something crucial. His attachment wasn't about Janapada Kalyani at all. It was about the craving itself, looking for somewhere to land. And craving is never satisfied. Even if Nanda had married Janapada Kalyani, the craving wouldn't have ended. It would have found new forms, craving for her to be different, craving for the relationship to feel like it did in the beginning, craving for the anxiety about losing her to finally quiet down. Even if someone chooses you, craving doesn't stop. It just changes what it's craving for. This is why the Buddha taught that the problem isn't the object of desire, but the relationship to desire itself. Love, in its pure form, doesn't demand. It appreciates without clinging. It values without controlling. It wishes well-being for the other person without making that well-being a condition for your own peace. Attachment does the opposite. Attachment says, I need you to be a certain way, so I can be okay. I need you to choose me, so I can feel worthy. I need you to stay so I can feel secure. I need you to love me in the specific way I want to be loved, or else I'll suffer. Notice the I need in all of those. That's craving speaking, not love. Love can coexist with loss. You can love someone and accept that they're not choosing you. You can value connection and simultaneously recognize when connection isn't reciprocated. You can feel sadness about an ending without making that ending into a catastrophe about your worth. But craving can't coexist with anything except getting what it wants. Craving is all or nothing, black or white, now or never. And because reality rarely gives us exactly what we want, exactly when we want it, in exactly the form we want it, craving guarantees suffering. After Nanda saw the hell realms, something fundamental shifted in him. He didn't try to replace his craving for celestial nymphs with craving for something else. He didn't attempt to force himself to stop wanting what he wanted. Instead, he started investigating craving itself. He began noticing how it arose in his mind, the sudden tightening, the mental reaching, the subtle or not so subtle demand that this moment be different from what it is. He noticed how craving always came with a story. I need this because, or I can't be happy unless, or this will finally make me feel. And most importantly, he noticed that every time he believed these stories, suffering followed. Not sometimes, not occasionally, but every single time. The texts tell us that Nanda eventually became an arahant, fully enlightened, completely free from craving. Not because he got what he wanted or because he transcended all desire, but because he understood craving so thoroughly that it lost its power over him. He saw it arising anew. This is just craving. It's not truth. It's not wisdom. It's a conditioned pattern that will create suffering if I believe it and act from it. And in that seeing, in that clear recognition of what craving actually is, freedom became possible. When someone doesn't choose you, you have the same opportunity Nanda had. You can keep feeding the craving, analyzing why they didn't choose you, comparing yourself to whoever they did choose, trying to figure out how to become more acceptable, rehearsing what you should have said or done differently. Or you can start investigating the craving itself. What does it feel like in your body when you're craving their attention, their choice, their validation? Where do you feel it? In your chest, your throat, your stomach? What thoughts come with it? What stories does your mind tell about why this craving is justified or necessary or different from all other cravings. The investigation isn't about making the craving wrong. It's about seeing it clearly. Because what you see clearly loses its power to control you unconsciously. Nanda's freedom didn't come from Janapada Kalyani finally choosing him, or from obtaining celestial nymphs, or from avoiding hell. His freedom came from understanding that all of his suffering, every bit of it, was being created by his relationship to wanting, not by whether he got what he wanted. The moment you understand this in your own experience, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but definitely. You start to notice craving as it arises, rather than being consumed by it. You start to recognize the difference between genuine care and desperate grasping. You start to see that your peace doesn't actually depend on being chosen. It depends on releasing the insistence that you must be chosen in order to be okay. And once you see that clearly, the path forward becomes obvious. Not easy, but obvious. Because you finally understand what the Buddha was teaching. The problem was never that you weren't chosen. The problem was making being chosen into a requirement for your peace. And requirements, when reality doesn't meet them, create only one thing: suffering. Shortly after his enlightenment, the Buddha was traveling with a group of former fire worshippers who had become his students. These were people who had spent years conducting elaborate rituals around fire, believing that properly tending flames would bring blessings and prevent misfortune. They understood fire intimately, how it starts, what feeds it, how it spreads, how it consumes. They knew that fire was never static, always hungry, always seeking fuel. The Buddha brought them to a hillside and began teaching in language they would understand. "Monks," he said, "all is burning. Not some things, not just certain experiences, all of it. The eye is burning. Forms are burning. Eye consciousness is burning. Eye contact is burning. Whatever feeling arises with eye contact as condition, pleasant, painful, or neither pleasant nor painful, that too is burning." He went through each sense systematically. The ear is burning, sounds are burning. The nose is burning. The tongue is burning. Tastes are burning. The body is burning. Tactile objects are burning. The mind is burning. Thoughts are burning. Everything you experience through your senses, everything you think about, everything you feel, all of it burning. The monks must have felt the weight of this teaching settling over them. They had spent years trying to control external fires, conducting rituals to appease flame, believing that if they just performed the ceremonies correctly, they could prevent burning. Now the Buddha was telling them that the real fire wasn't outside. It was internal, continuous, burning through every moment of experience. Then he asked the question that makes this teaching cut to the core. Burning with what? The monks leaned in, waiting. Burning with the fire of greed, with the fire of hatred, with the fire of delusion. Burning with birth, aging, and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. This wasn't poetry. This was description. The Buddha was naming the exact experience of internal burning that every human knows but rarely understands. And if you've ever chased someone who doesn't choose you, you know exactly what this burning feels like. Your chest burns with longing every time you think about them. Your mind burns with obsessive thinking, analyzing every interaction, every word, every silence. Your body burns with anxiety when you see they've read your message but haven't responded. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from this kind of chasing. Not the physical tiredness of running after something, but the deeper depletion of constantly reaching for what moves away, constantly hoping for what doesn't come, constantly offering yourself to someone who isn't receiving. You check your phone even though you know there won't be a message. You replay conversations looking for signs you might have missed. You adjust your behavior, your appearance, your availability, hoping that if you just get the formula right, they'll finally choose you. And beneath all of this activity is a question that burns. What do I need to do to make them see me? The Buddha's fire sermon reveals something crucial about what's actually happening when you chase. This burning isn't coming from the other person. They're not setting you on fire. You're burning from the inside, from 3 specific fires the Buddha named. The first fire is greed, the grasping, demanding quality of wanting. When you chase someone who doesn't choose you, the greed is obvious. You want them, you crave their attention, you desire their choice. This wanting feels natural, even justified. Of course you want them. They matter to you. You feel connection. You see potential. But greed in the Buddhist sense isn't just wanting. It's the insistence that you must have what you want, the refusal to accept reality when reality says no. You can want something and simultaneously accept that you don't have it. That's disappointment, which is natural and temporary. But greed adds the demand. Reality is wrong for not giving me this, and I will not accept this outcome, and I will keep reaching until I get what I want. That demand keeps the fire burning. Every text you send hoping for a different response, fuel for the fire of greed. Every time you refresh their social media to see what they're doing, more fuel. Every mental rehearsal of what you should have said or could still say, fuel. Every attempt to become more attractive, more interesting, more available, fuel. the fire grows hotter with each addition. You might notice this in your body, the tightness in your chest when you think about them, the restlessness that makes it hard to focus on anything else, the way your heart races when their name appears on your screen. This physical burning is the manifestation of greed working through your system. It's not metaphorical. Your nervous system is actually activated. Your stress hormones are elevated. Your body is in a state of constant reaching. The second fire is hatred, but not in the way you might expect. You might not think you hate the person who doesn't choose you. In fact, you probably believe you care about them deeply. But hatred in Buddhist terms isn't just anger or rage. It's aversion, the pushing away of what is. When you chase someone who doesn't choose you, you're in a constant state of aversion to reality. You're rejecting what's actually happening and insisting it should be different. This rejection burns. It creates a constant friction between what is and what you demand should be. And that friction, that refusal to accept reality as it presents itself, feeds the fire continuously. You can feel this friction in the way your mind argues with itself. One part says, "They're not interested," and another part immediately counters, "But maybe they're just busy," or "Maybe they're afraid," or "Maybe I just need to try one more time." This internal argument is the fire of aversion burning through your mental space. It consumes enormous energy because you're fighting with reality moment by moment, refusing to let things be as they are. Sometimes the aversion turns toward yourself. You hate that you can't let go, hate that you're still thinking about them, hate that you're behaving in ways that feel desperate or undignified. That self-directed aversion is also fuel for the fire. Every time you criticize yourself for still caring, every time you judge yourself for not being over it yet, you're adding another log to the blaze. The third fire is delusion, and this might be the most important of all. Delusion here doesn't mean you're stupid or out of touch with reality. It means you're misunderstanding something fundamental about how things work. When you chase what doesn't choose you, the delusion usually takes one of several forms. You might believe that if you just try hard enough, they'll eventually see your value. This is delusion about control, the belief that your effort can override someone else's lack of interest. You might believe that being chosen by them will solve something essential about your life. This is delusion about where peace comes from, the belief that external validation creates internal stability. You might believe that you can't be okay without them choosing you. This is delusion about your own wholeness, the belief that another person's decision determines your fundamental worth or capacity for peace. All of these delusions feed the fire because they keep you engaged with a false narrative about what's happening and what's possible. Delusion is particularly insidious because it sounds so reasonable. Your mind constructs elaborate justifications for why this situation is different, why your efforts will eventually pay off, why waiting just a little longer makes sense. But underneath all the reasonable-sounding thoughts is a fundamental misunderstanding. You believe you can make someone choose you through force of will, or depth of feeling, or strategic behavior. You can't. You never could. And every moment you believe you can is a moment you're feeding the fire of delusion. The monks listening to the fire sermon understood something crucial from their years of working with actual fire. They knew that you don't need to destroy fire or fight against it. You simply stop feeding it, and it takes care of itself. Fire needs fuel to burn. Without fuel, fire goes out naturally, not because you forced it out or smothered it, but because nothing remains to feed it. When you chase what doesn't choose you, you are the one adding fuel. You're not just passively experiencing the burning, you're actively maintaining it. This is where the Buddha's teaching becomes profoundly empowering. Because if you're the one feeding the fire, you're also the one who can stop. This is the Buddha's teaching on cessation, the third noble truth. Suffering doesn't end because you achieve some special state or transcend your humanity or convince yourself not to care. Suffering ends when you stop creating it. And you stop creating it by stopping the craving and grasping that fuel it. The Buddha's teaching on fire is radical because it shows you where your power actually is. You can't control whether someone chooses you. You can't force interest where it doesn't exist. You can't make someone see you the way you want to be seen. But you can stop adding fuel to the fire that's burning you. This doesn't mean you force yourself to stop caring. It doesn't mean you suppress your feelings or pretend you're fine when you're not. It means you stop the specific actions, internal and external, that keep the fire raging. You stop checking if they've responded when you know they haven't. You stop analyzing what went wrong, as if analysis will change the outcome. You stop offering more of yourself, hoping they'll finally receive it. You stop telling yourself stories about how this will eventually work out if you just wait long enough. Each of these is a log you're throwing on the fire. When you stop throwing logs, the fire doesn't immediately go out. There's still heat, still burning, still pain. But without new fuel, the fire begins to consume what remains and naturally diminishes. Think about what happens when you actually stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. At first, the urge to check intensifies. This is the fire burning through the fuel that's already there. But if you don't add new fuel by giving in to the urge, the intensity gradually decreases. The same happens with replaying conversations or imagining scenarios where they change their mind. When you catch yourself doing it and simply stop, not by force, but by recognition, the activity naturally winds down. And here's the compassionate truth in this teaching. You're not burning because something is wrong with you. You're burning because you're human, and you were never taught how to relate to wanting without turning it into fuel. Nobody showed you the difference between appreciating someone and grasping for them. Nobody explained that you could feel disappointed without making disappointment into an identity. Nobody taught you that your peace doesn't actually depend on being chosen, even though it feels like it does. So you keep adding fuel, because that's what humans do when they don't understand the mechanics of their own suffering. The fire sermon ends with a simple instruction. When you see clearly that everything is burning with greed, hatred, and delusion, you become disenchanted with the senses, disenchanted with contact, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with craving. Disenchantment doesn't mean you become cynical or cold. It means you stop being enchanted by the fantasy that chasing will eventually lead to catching, that craving will eventually lead to satisfaction, that burning will eventually lead to peace. You see clearly, this doesn't work. This has never worked. This will never work. And in that clear seeing, something natural happens. Your hand stops reaching for the logs, not because someone forced it to stop, but because you finally understand that throwing logs on a fire makes it burn more, not less. When you stop chasing what doesn't choose you, the fire doesn't go out immediately. The burning continues for a while because there's still fuel that was already added. But you're no longer actively maintaining it. You're no longer checking your phone compulsively. You're no longer replaying conversations, looking for what you missed. You're no longer trying to become whoever you think they want you to be. You're simply letting the fire burn through what remains without adding more. And eventually, not immediately, but eventually, the fire goes out on its own. Not because you forced it out, or because you transcended your humanity, or because you finally stopped caring. It goes out because fire, without fuel, cannot sustain itself. This is the teaching. You don't have to extinguish the fire of suffering. You simply have to stop feeding it. Stop feeding the greed by releasing the demand that they choose you. Stop feeding the hatred by accepting reality as it is. Stop feeding the delusion by seeing clearly that your worth doesn't depend on their decision. And when you stop feeding these fires, when you finally let your hands rest instead of constantly reaching, something unexpected becomes possible. Not immediate peace, not instant relief, but the beginning of cessation. The burning starts to quiet, The exhaustion starts to lift. The obsessive thinking starts to slow. Not because anything external changed, but because you stopped maintaining the internal conditions that created the burning in the first place. The Buddha ended the fire sermon by saying that when you see this clearly, you become dispassionate, and through dispassion, you are liberated. Liberation isn't a distant spiritual state. It's what remains when you stop burning yourself with craving, aversion, and delusion. It's the natural coolness that appears when fire is no longer being fed. It's the spaciousness that emerges when your energy is no longer consumed by constant reaching. It's the clarity that becomes possible when smoke clears and you can finally see what's actually in front of you. And the path to that liberation begins the moment you recognize, I am feeding this fire and I can stop. The Buddha once told a story about a time in a previous life when he was a crow. One day, this crow found a piece of meat, not a large piece, but substantial enough to matter. The crow picked it up in its beak and flew away, pleased with its discovery. But an eagle had been watching. The eagle began chasing the crow, diving and attacking, trying to steal the meat. The crow flew as fast as it could, clutching the meat tightly in its beak, refusing to let go of what it had found. The eagle pursued relentlessly. It struck the crow with its talons, tore at the crow's wings, attacked again and again. The crow's body became battered and bloodied from the assault, but still it held on to the meat. This went on for a long time, the crow desperately trying to escape while holding the meat, the eagle violently pursuing. The crow grew exhausted from the effort of flying while being attacked, from the pain of its injuries, from the terror of being hunted. Finally, the crow could hold on no longer. Not because it chose to let go, but because it was too depleted to keep grasping. The meat fell from its beak and dropped to the ground below. And the moment the meat fell, something extraordinary happened. The eagle stopped chasing. It dove down to claim the meat on the ground and flew away, no longer interested in the crow at all. The crow, now flying without the burden of the meat and without the threat of the eagle, found itself suddenly free. The attack ceased. The pursuit ended. The terror dissolved. In that moment, the crow understood something profound. The suffering hadn't been caused by the eagle. The suffering had been caused by holding on to the meat. The Buddha ended the story by saying, I was that crow. Attachment is the meat. Let it go. This story reveals something essential about what happens when someone doesn't choose you and you can't let go. You become like the crow, clutching tightly to something, not meat, but the idea of them, the hope of them choosing you, the fantasy of how things could be if only they would see your value. And as you hold on, you're being attacked. Not by an eagle, but by your own suffering, the obsessive thinking that won't stop, the anxiety that keeps you tense, the replaying of conversations that never brings clarity, the constant checking for messages that don't arrive. The tighter you grip, the more violent the assault becomes. But you keep holding on because you believe that letting go means losing something important. You believe that if you just hold on long enough, somehow the suffering will stop and you'll get to keep what you're clutching. What the crow discovered is what the Buddha taught repeatedly. The suffering doesn't stop until you release what you're grasping. Most people misunderstand what letting go means in Buddhism. They think it means you stop caring. They think it means you become cold or indifferent or detached in a way that makes you less human. They think it means giving up on love, on connection, on the possibility of meaningful relationship. But that's not what letting go means at all. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring about the person who didn't choose you. It means you stop making your peace conditional on them choosing you. Letting go doesn't mean you become emotionally numb. It means you stop demanding that reality be different from what it is. Letting go doesn't mean you'll never feel pain again. It means you stop creating additional suffering by arguing with the pain that's already here. The crow in the story didn't stop being a crow when it released the meat. It didn't transcend its nature or become something other than what it was. It simply stopped clutching something that was causing it to be attacked. And in that release, it found freedom, not from being a crow, but from the suffering that came from holding on. When someone doesn't choose you, there's real loss involved. You lose the possibility you imagined. You lose the future you were hoping for. You lose the connection you valued, at least in the form you wanted it to take. That loss is painful, and the pain is valid. Letting go doesn't erase that pain or make it disappear. What letting go does is stop you from adding layers of suffering on top of the pain. Think about the crow's experience. There was the meat, a real thing it had found and wanted to keep. Losing the meat involved genuine loss. The crow would go hungry, at least for a while. But the suffering, the attacks, the injuries, the exhaustion, the terror, all of that was created by holding on, not by the loss itself. When the crow released the meat, it still didn't have the meat. The loss remained, but the suffering ended. This is the distinction the Buddha kept pointing to. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is created by our relationship to pain. When you let go of someone who didn't choose you, the disappointment doesn't vanish. The sadness about what might have been doesn't disappear. The grief over the ending of possibility remains for a time. But the suffering, the constant mental torture, the obsessive analysis, the self-blame, the desperate grasping for what isn't there, that can end. It ends not when circumstances change, but when you stop clutching. Most people resist letting go because they confuse it with giving up. They think, if I let go, I'm admitting defeat. I'm saying they were right not to choose me. I'm accepting that I'm not enough. But letting go has nothing to do with your worth. The crow's worth as a crow wasn't determined by whether it kept the meat. The crow was still a crow, still capable of flight, still able to search for food, still fundamentally whole, regardless of whether it held on to that particular piece of meat. Your worth as a person isn't determined by whether someone chooses you. You're still whole, still capable of connection, still fundamentally valuable, regardless of this person's decision. Letting go is simply the recognition that holding on is causing suffering without changing the outcome. The meat had already fallen to the ground in the sense that this person has already not chosen you. The reality has already happened. Holding on doesn't change what already is. It only prolongs the attack. There's also a deep fear that if you let go, you'll lose your connection to love itself. People worry. If I stop hoping for them, if I release my attachment to them choosing me, will I become someone who can't love? Will I close my heart? Will I miss out on love in the future because I've become too guarded? Buddhism teaches the opposite. Attachment closes your heart. Letting go opens it. When you're attached, when you're like the crow desperately clutching the meat while being attacked, your entire world narrows to that one thing. You can't see anything else. You can't receive anything else. You can't experience anything else fully, because all your energy is consumed by holding on and protecting yourself from the attack that holding on creates. The moment the crow released the meat, its world opened up again. It could fly freely. It could see the sky, feel the wind, notice other possibilities for food. It could return to being a crow living in the world, instead of a crow trapped in desperate clutching. When you let go of someone who didn't choose you, something similar happens. Your attention, which has been completely consumed by one person and one outcome, begins to expand again. You start noticing your own life, the friendships you've been neglecting, the activities that used to bring you joy. the moments of beauty that have been happening around you while you were trapped in obsessive thinking. You become available for connection again, not necessarily romantic connection, though that may come, but connection to yourself, to others, to the present moment. The Buddha taught that clinging and grasping create a contracted state. When you clench your fist tightly around something, your whole body tenses. When you clench your mind around an outcome, your entire being contracts. Letting go is release of that contraction. It's not that you stop caring. Caring can remain. It's not that you stop feeling. Feelings can still arise and pass. But you're no longer contracted around demanding that reality be different from what it is. There's a practice in Buddhism called non-clinging, and it's different from detachment in the way most people understand detachment. Detachment, as commonly understood, suggests you step back from life, that you stop engaging, that you protect yourself by not caring. Non-clinging means you engage fully with life. You allow yourself to care. You remain open to connection, but you don't grasp. You appreciate without possessing. You value without demanding. You care without making your peace conditional on specific outcomes. Think again of the crow. After releasing the meat and escaping the eagle, the crow didn't stop eating. It didn't decide that searching for food was too risky, or that wanting nourishment was the problem. The crow continued being a crow, continued seeking food when hungry, continued engaging with life. But it learned something about the difference between finding food and being attacked for food, between nourishment and desperate clinging that invites assault. When you let go of someone who didn't choose you, you're not deciding never to want connection again. You're not protecting yourself by shutting down. You're learning the difference between appreciating connection and being attacked by your own desperate grasping for it. The practice of letting go involves several movements, and they don't all happen at once. The first movement is recognition. You begin to see that you're like the crow. You're being attacked. You're suffering, and the suffering is connected to what you're clutching. This recognition often comes as exhaustion. You realize you can't keep doing this. You can't keep checking your phone obsessively. You can't keep replaying the same scenarios in your mind. You can't keep offering yourself to someone who isn't receiving you. The exhaustion itself is information. It's your system saying, this isn't sustainable. This is depleting you. Something needs to change. The second movement is willingness. You become willing to consider that holding on might be optional. You become willing to entertain the possibility that you could survive without them choosing you. You become willing to examine what you're actually clutching and whether clutching it serves you. Willingness doesn't mean you know how to let go yet. It just means you're no longer insisting that holding on is the only option. The third movement is the actual release. For the crow, this happened through exhaustion. It literally could no longer hold on. For humans, release can happen different ways. Sometimes it happens through a conscious decision. I am choosing to stop feeding this, to stop checking, to stop offering what isn't wanted. Sometimes it happens through understanding. You see so clearly that holding on creates suffering, that your hand naturally opens, not through force, but through wisdom. Sometimes it happens through simple passage of time. One day you realize you haven't thought about them in hours, and the clutching has loosened without you noticing exactly when it happened. The release rarely feels victorious or empowering in the moment. For the crow, the release came from depletion, not from strength. The meat fell because the crow couldn't hold it anymore, not because the crow made some heroic decision to let go. Sometimes that's how it is for us too. We don't let go because we've achieved some enlightened state where we're above caring. We let go because we're finally too tired to hold on, because the suffering has become more unbearable than the fear of letting go. And that's okay. The Buddha wasn't teaching perfection. He was teaching release from suffering. However, the release happens through strength or through exhaustion, through wisdom or through depletion. The result is the same: freedom from the attack that holding on creates. After the release comes the fourth movement, the discovery of what remains. The crow discovered it could fly freely once the meat was gone and the eagle had departed. It discovered that being without the meat was actually preferable to being with the meat and being attacked for it. When you let go of someone who didn't choose you, you make a similar discovery. You discover that you're still here. You still exist without them choosing you. Your life continues. Your breath continues. Your capacity for joy hasn't disappeared just because this one connection didn't work out the way you hoped. You discover that the hole you thought would consume you is actually just space. Uncomfortable space sometimes. Sad space sometimes, but just space nonetheless. And space, you learn, is where new things can enter. When your hands are clenched tightly around something, they can't receive anything else. When they open, when they release, they become available again. This doesn't mean you immediately find someone else, or that you stop caring about the person who didn't choose you. It means your life is no longer consumed by desperate clutching, and in that non-consumption, you have energy available for other things, for yourself, for healing, for growth, for presence with what's actually here, rather than constant yearning for what isn't. The Buddha emphasized that letting go is a practice, not a one-time event. You might let go and then find yourself clutching again. You might release and then grab back. You might think you've let go, only to discover layers of holding on that you didn't see before. This isn't failure. This is the nature of practice. Each time you recognize you're clutching, and each time you practice releasing, you're training yourself in a new way of relating to loss, to disappointment, to not getting what you want. You're learning that you can survive without clutching. You're discovering that letting go doesn't destroy you. You're experiencing directly that release brings relief, even when it also brings sadness. Over time, the practice becomes more natural. You notice clutching arising sooner. You recognize the signs, the tightness in your chest, the obsessive quality of your thoughts, the way you're scanning for information that will change the reality you don't want to accept. And you remember, this is like the crow holding the meat while being attacked. Holding on doesn't make the meat mine. It just means I keep getting hurt. The Buddha's teaching on letting go isn't about transcending human feeling or becoming invulnerable to pain. It's about understanding the mechanics of suffering clearly enough that you stop creating unnecessary suffering on top of inevitable pain. The crow didn't stop being a creature that needs food. It didn't transcend hunger or become beyond the need for nourishment. But it learned that being attacked while trying to keep food is worse than letting food go and finding peace. You don't stop being someone who wants connection and love. You don't transcend the human need for belonging and being chosen. But you learn that being attacked by your own desperate grasping is worse than letting go and finding peace. And once you learn this, once you experience directly that release brings relief, even when it brings loss, you have a choice you didn't have before. You can continue clutching and being attacked. The meat might be gone either way, but only one of those options ends the suffering. And that ending, that release from being attacked by your own attachment, is what the Buddha meant by liberation. Not liberation from feeling, not liberation from caring, not liberation from being human. Liberation from suffering. Liberation from the attack that comes from desperate clutching. Liberation that arrives the moment you finally let go. Among the Buddha's disciples, there was a monk named Channa who was impossible. Channa had known the Buddha before enlightenment. They had grown up together in the palace, and Channa had been the charioteer who helped the Buddha escape to begin his spiritual search. Because of this history, Channa believed he deserved special treatment, special access, special exemption from the rules that applied to everyone else. He was arrogant, argumentative, and refused to take correction from anyone. When senior monks tried to guide him, he dismissed them. When fellow monks pointed out his behavior, he became defensive and aggressive. He quarreled constantly, disrupted the harmony of the community, and insisted he knew better than everyone else. The other monks grew exhausted trying to work with him. They tried patience. They tried direct confrontation. They tried gentle guidance. They tried firm boundaries. Nothing penetrated his armor of self-righteousness. Finally, they came to the Buddha and said, "We can't continue with Channa in the community. He refuses to change. He disrupts everything, and he makes practice impossible for the rest of us. He needs to be expelled." The Buddha listened carefully. He understood their frustration, their exhaustion, their sense that they'd tried everything. But he didn't expel Channa. Instead, he said, "When I die, give Channa, the Brahma, Danda, the highest punishment." The monks were confused. What was this punishment? What could be more severe than expulsion? The Buddha explained, "No one in the Sangha should speak to Channa, instruct him, or associate with him. Complete silence, total withdrawal of relationship. This wasn't cruelty. This was the only remaining boundary that might penetrate Channa's defenses." Years later, after the Buddha's death, the monks implemented the Brahma Danda. They stopped speaking to Channa, stopped responding to his provocations, stopped engaging with his arguments. And Channa, for the first time in his life, was truly alone. At first, he responded with more arrogance. He didn't need them anyway. He was special because of his history. With the Buddha, their silence proved they were the problem, not him. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, something began to crack. Without anyone to argue with, he had to sit with his own mind. Without anyone to blame, he had to look at his own behavior. Without anyone reflecting back his specialness, he had to face his own suffering. The solitude became a mirror. And in that mirror, for the first time, Channa saw himself clearly, not the special person he'd been telling himself he was, but an arrogant, defensive, suffering human being who'd been pushing everyone away because he was afraid of being ordinary. He broke down completely. The texts say he wept, overcome with the recognition of how much harm he'd caused, how much pain he'd been carrying, how isolated he'd made himself through his behavior. He went to the senior monk Ananda and said, "I've been impossible. I know this now. Please teach me." And Ananda, seeing that Channa had finally become teachable, lifted the Brahma Danda and began instructing him. Channa practiced with humility for the first time in his life. And through that practice, the texts tell us He became fully enlightened, completely freed from the suffering that had driven his arrogance all along. This story reveals something crucial about what happens after someone doesn't choose you. You might find yourself alone, not because you're being punished, but because sometimes solitude is exactly what allows you to see clearly. Most people fear being alone after not being chosen. The fear sounds like this: if I'm alone, it proves I'm unlovable. If no one chooses me, something must be fundamentally wrong with me. If I end up by myself, I've failed at the most basic human task of connection. But Buddhism teaches something different about solitude. Solitude isn't punishment. Solitude is clarity. When Channa was forced into solitude through the Brahma Danda, it wasn't because he was unworthy of relationship. It was because relationship kept allowing him to avoid looking at himself. As long as he had people to argue with, he could keep projecting his suffering outward. As long as he had others to blame, he could avoid facing his own pain. As long as he could maintain his armor of specialness through interaction, he never had to examine what that armor was protecting. The solitude removed all those distractions. When someone doesn't choose you, and you find yourself alone, something similar is happening. The noise stops. The constant seeking for their validation stops. The analyzing and strategizing and hoping stops. And in that stopping, you're left with yourself. For many people, this feels unbearable at first. The mind fills the silence with harsh commentary. See, you're alone because you're not enough, because you're too much, because something about you is fundamentally wrong. But this is where self-compassion becomes essential. Self-compassion in Buddhism isn't about convincing yourself you're special or perfect or above criticism. It's about meeting yourself with the same kindness you'd offer to anyone who's suffering. Channa's breakthrough came when he finally stopped defending himself and allowed himself to feel the pain he'd been avoiding. He stopped trying to be special and allowed himself to be ordinary, an ordinary human being who suffers, who makes mistakes, who needs guidance, who's learning. That allowance, that acceptance of his own humanity was an act of self-compassion, even though it felt like falling apart. When you're alone after not being chosen, self-compassion means you stop making your solitude mean something terrible about you. You stop the narrative that says, I'm alone because I'm unlovable. You recognize instead, I'm alone right now because this particular connection didn't align, and being alone is giving me space to heal, to see clearly, to remember who I am without constantly reaching for someone else's validation. Self-compassion also means you stop betraying yourself to avoid being alone. The Buddha's teaching to Channa through the Brahmadanda was essentially this: staying in relationship with you while you continue harming yourself and others isn't compassionate, it's enabling. Sometimes the most compassionate response is withdrawal, is boundary, is allowing someone to face themselves without the distraction of relationship. When you apply this to yourself, it means staying in pursuit of someone who doesn't choose you isn't loyalty or love, it's self-betrayal. Choosing to be alone rather than continuing to chase someone who isn't receiving you is an act of self-compassion, even though it feels like loss. There's a practice in Buddhism called metta, loving kindness, meditation. Traditionally, it begins with directing kindness toward yourself before extending it to others. The phrases are simple: may I be safe, may I be happy, may I be healthy, may I live with ease. But when you're suffering from not being chosen, these phrases can feel hollow. How can I wish myself happiness when I feel this bad? How can I wish myself ease when everything feels difficult? The practice isn't about making yourself feel better immediately. It's about continuing to offer kindness to yourself, even when you're suffering, especially when you're suffering. Channa couldn't receive kindness from others because he couldn't be kind to himself. His arrogance was armor protecting against the fundamental belief that he wasn't okay as he was. When the armor finally cracked and he saw himself clearly, with all his flaws, all his suffering, all his ordinary humanity, he could finally extend compassion to himself. And that self-compassion opened him to receive teaching, to practice genuinely, to transform. Being alone after not being chosen gives you the same opportunity. You can use the solitude to confirm your worst fears about yourself, to rehearse all the ways you're not enough, to catalogue your perceived failures, to build a case for your unlovability. Or you can use the solitude as Channa eventually did, to see yourself clearly without the distortion of desperate seeking, to meet yourself with compassion rather than judgment, to recognize that not being chosen by one person doesn't determine your fundamental worth. The clarity that comes from solitude isn't always comfortable. Channa had to face how his behavior had pushed people away, how his arrogance had been covering fear, how his insistence on being special had prevented genuine connection. When you're alone after not being chosen, you might face similar recognitions. You might see how you gave away your power by making someone else responsible for your happiness. You might recognize patterns, how this isn't the first time you've chased someone unavailable, how you have a tendency to lose yourself in relationships, how you struggle to trust your own worth without external validation. These recognitions can be painful, but they're also liberating because you can't change what you can't see. Buddhism teaches that ignorance is one of the root causes of suffering. Not ignorance in the sense of lacking information, but ignorance of how things actually are. Ignorance of impermanence, ignorance of your true nature, ignorance of the patterns that create your suffering. Solitude removes the distractions that maintain ignorance. When you're constantly focused on someone else, on getting them to choose you, on analyzing their behavior, on managing your presentation to be more acceptable, you're not present to yourself. Solitude brings you back to yourself. And being present to yourself, really present, with compassion and honesty, is where transformation becomes possible. The Buddha didn't abandon jhana by prescribing the Brahma Danda. He gave jhana the exact medicine he needed, even though the medicine was bitter. Sometimes you need to give yourself the same medicine. You need to stop chasing the person who didn't choose you. You need to sit with the discomfort of being alone. You need to face yourself without the distraction of external seeking. This isn't punishment. This is compassion. Because continuing to betray yourself by chasing what's not reciprocated is the real cruelty. Continuing to abandon your own needs in service of someone else's lack of interest is the real harm. Choosing solitude over self-betrayal is choosing yourself. Not in the egoic sense of, I'm too good for people who don't choose me, but in the compassionate sense of, I deserve to stop suffering, and continuing to chase what doesn't choose me is creating suffering. After Jhana's breakthrough, after he became teachable and began genuine practice, he didn't become a different person. He was still Jhana, still the same person, with the same history, the same personality, the same tendencies. But he was jhana awake rather than jhana asleep. Jhana seeing clearly rather than jhana lost in defensive delusion. Jhana able to receive guidance and connection rather than jhana pushing everything away through arrogance. When you emerge from solitude after not being chosen, you don't become a different person either. You're still you, still with your history, your personality, your vulnerabilities, your desire for connection. But you might be you awake rather than you asleep. You seeing clearly rather than you lost in desperate grasping. You able to receive genuine connection rather than you pushing it away through self-betrayal and neediness. The solitude doesn't fix you because nothing about you was broken. The solitude clarifies you. It removes the noise so you can hear yourself again. It creates space so you can see what's actually true rather than what you've been desperately hoping might be true. And in that clarity, self-compassion becomes possible, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. You stop arguing with reality about whether you should be alone. You accept that right now, you are alone, and you meet yourself in that aloneness, with kindness rather than judgment. You stop making solitude mean you're unlovable, and start recognizing solitude as the space where you can finally stop abandoning yourself in pursuit of someone who isn't choosing you. The Buddha gave Channa the Brahma Danda, not as abandonment, but as the boundary that would finally allow Channa to face himself and transform. Life has given you something similar, the experience of not being chosen, which creates space for you to stop seeking externally and start seeing internally. What you do with that space is your choice. You can fill it with harsh self-judgment and desperate seeking for the next person who might validate you. Or you can use it, as Channa eventually did, as an opportunity to wake up, to see clearly, to meet yourself with compassion, to learn something that will serve you for the rest of your life. The teaching isn't that you should always be alone, or that solitude is superior to connection. The teaching is that sometimes being alone is exactly what allows you to become someone who can genuinely connect, someone who doesn't betray themselves in relationship, someone who can appreciate without grasping, someone who knows their worth, isn't determined by being chosen. And that knowing, that clarity, that self-compassion learned in solitude, that's what makes you free. The Buddha had a son named Rahula, who became a monk when he was very young. One day, when Rahula was still learning, the Buddha took him aside for a private teaching. He picked up a piece of cloth that had been used for cleaning, dirty, stained, clearly impure. The Buddha held up the cloth and asked Rahula, "Do you see this cloth?" Rahula nodded. "Do you see how dirty it is? Do you see the stains?" Again, Rahula nodded. The stains were obvious, impossible to miss. The Buddha then said something that would become one of his most important teachings on practice. Just as this cloth can become pure when washed with water and soap, so too the mind can be purified when you see clearly what makes it impure. But then he emphasized the crucial point. First, you must see the stains clearly. You cannot clean what you do not see. You cannot purify what you deny or ignore or pretend isn't there. This teaching reveals the foundation of all Buddhist practice. Awareness comes before transformation. When someone doesn't choose you and you're suffering, the first step isn't to force yourself to let go, or to convince yourself you shouldn't care, or to transcend your feelings through spiritual practice. The first step is to see clearly what's actually happening in your mind. Most people don't do this. They're so uncomfortable with their suffering that they immediately try to fix it, escape it, explain it away, or numb it through distraction. But the Buddha's teaching to his son was clear. You must see the stains before you can clean the cloth. So what does it mean to see attachment as it arises? It means you notice the moment your mind starts reaching. You're going about your day, and suddenly you're thinking about the person who didn't choose you. You're imagining what you could say to change their mind, or you're replaying the last conversation, looking for what went wrong, or you're fantasizing about them, realizing they made a mistake. Usually, you're so absorbed in these thoughts that you don't notice you're thinking them. The thinking has you, you're not aware of it, you're inside it, completely identified with it. But if you're practicing awareness, there's a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes sustained, where you notice, oh, I'm doing it again. I'm reaching for them mentally. I'm replaying scenarios. I'm grasping. That noticing is awareness. It's the moment when you see the stain on the cloth. The Buddha taught his son that this seeing must be done without judgment. When Rahula looked at the dirty cloth, he didn't judge the cloth for being dirty. He didn't make the cloth wrong or bad or defective. He simply saw, this cloth has stains on it. When you notice attachment arising in your mind, when you catch yourself obsessing about someone who didn't choose you, the practice is to see it the same way, not as evidence that something is wrong with you, but as simple observation of what's present. Oh, attachment is here right now. Grasping is happening. The mind is reaching for what isn't available. No judgment, no shame, no story about what it means that you're still doing this. Just clear seeing, this is what's happening right now. Most people make awareness harder than it needs to be because they add commentary to what they observe. They notice they're thinking about the person and immediately add, I shouldn't still be thinking about them. What's wrong with me? Why can't I get over this? I'm pathetic for still caring. All of that is not awareness. That's judgment about awareness. The Buddha taught Rahula to distinguish between the stain and the story about the stain. The stain is simply what's present, a mark on fabric, a mental pattern of attachment, a moment of grasping. The story about the stain is the elaborate narrative you build around it, what it means, why it's there, what it says about you, how you should feel about it. Awareness is seeing the stain without the story. When you can do this, when you can notice attachment arising without immediately judging yourself for it, something important happens. The attachment doesn't immediately disappear, but your relationship to it changes. You're no longer completely identified with the grasping. There's a little space between you and it, enough space to observe it, to recognize it as a pattern rather than as truth. to see it clearly rather than being consumed by it. This space is where freedom begins. The Buddha taught several specific ways to develop this awareness, and they're all simple, but not easy. The first practice is noticing where attachment lives in your body. When you're grasping for someone who didn't choose you, it's not just a mental experience. Your body holds it. There might be tightness in your chest when you think about them. There might be a knot in your stomach when you check your phone hoping for a message. There might be tension in your shoulders, or shallowness in your breath, or a clenching in your jaw. The Buddha taught Rahula to use the body as a mirror for the mind. When you notice these physical sensations, you're seeing the stain on the cloth. You don't need to change the sensation. You don't need to make it go away. You simply feel it, acknowledge it, recognize this is what attachment feels like in my body right now. The practice is to stay with the sensation without immediately reaching for your phone or for distraction or for some way to escape the discomfort. Just feel the tightness in your chest. Just notice the knot in your stomach. Just observe how your breath becomes shallow when you're grasping. This sounds simple, but it's actually profound. Because most of your suffering comes not from the sensation itself, but from your resistance to the sensation. When you can simply be with the physical experience of attachment without fighting it or feeding it, you're practicing awareness. The second practice is noticing the quality of your thoughts. The Buddha taught that thoughts have a texture, a tone, a flavor. Thoughts rooted in attachment have a particular quality. They're repetitive, circular, urgent. When you're thinking clearly, your thoughts move naturally from one thing to another. There's a flow, a sense of presence with what's actually here. But when attachment is driving your thinking, the thoughts loop. You think the same things over and over, replaying conversations, imagining scenarios, analyzing what went wrong, strategizing what you could do differently. The content might vary slightly, but the pattern is the same. Reaching, grasping, trying to control something that's already happened or hasn't happened yet. The Buddha taught Rahula to recognize this quality of grasping mind as distinct from clear mind. When you notice your thoughts have that repetitive, urgent, grasping quality, you're seeing the stain. You don't need to stop the thoughts or replace them with better thoughts. You simply recognize, oh, grasping, mind is active right now. This recognition itself is awareness. And awareness, even without any attempt to change what's happening, begins to shift your relationship to what's arising. The third practice is observing the arising and passing of attachment. Everything that arises in the mind is impermanent. It comes, it stays for a while, and it passes. But when you're identified with attachment, it feels permanent. It feels like this grasping, this longing, this mental reaching will never end. The Buddha taught Rahula to notice not just the presence of mental states, but their temporary nature. You're thinking about the person obsessively. Your mind is completely consumed, and then the phone rings, or someone asks you a question, or you get absorbed in a task, and suddenly you realize you weren't thinking about them for 5 minutes. The attachment passed, not permanently, but temporarily. When you start noticing this, when you see that attachment comes and goes, rather than being a constant, unchanging state, you're seeing something crucial about its nature. It's not solid. It's not permanent. It's not who you are. It's a pattern that arises under certain conditions and passes when those conditions change. This seeing is liberating not because it makes the attachment go away, but because it reveals that you're not trapped in it. Just as the Buddha showed Rahula that a stained cloth can be cleaned, he was showing that the mind isn't permanently stuck in any pattern. Patterns arise and pass, and awareness allows you to see this clearly. The fourth practice is recognizing what triggers attachment to arise. The Buddha taught dependent origination, the principle that everything arises dependent on conditions. Attachment doesn't appear randomly. It arises when certain conditions are present. Maybe it arises when you're tired and your defenses are down. Maybe it arises when you see something that reminds you of the person. Maybe it arises when you're lonely, or bored, or feeling uncertain about yourself. When you start paying attention, you notice patterns. You start to see, oh, every evening around this time, the grasping intensifies. Or, when I'm scrolling social media, I start thinking about them more. Or, when I'm with coupled friends, the longing becomes stronger. The Buddha taught Rahula that seeing the conditions that give rise to defilements is part of seeing the defilements themselves. You're not trying to avoid the conditions or control them. You're simply seeing. These conditions tend to trigger grasping in my mind. This awareness gives you choice. Not the choice to never feel attachment, but the choice to recognize when conditions are likely to trigger it, and to meet those moments with more awareness, rather than being blindsided by them. The fifth practice is the most subtle, noticing the gap between seeing attachment and being attached. When you first start practicing awareness, it might feel like seeing attachment and experiencing attachment are the same thing. But as practice deepens, you start to notice something remarkable. There can be attachment present in your mind while simultaneously there's awareness observing that attachment. It's like the Buddha and Rahula looking at the stained cloth together. The stain is there, clearly visible. But neither the Buddha nor Rahula are the stain. They're the ones seeing the stain. When attachment arises in your mind and you notice it, who is doing the noticing? The attachment is a pattern, a mental formation, a temporary arising in consciousness. But the awareness that sees the attachment is something else. It's the capacity to observe without being caught, to see without being consumed. This distinction is crucial because it reveals that you are not your attachment. You are the awareness that can see attachment arising and passing. The Buddha didn't tell Rahula that having a dirty cloth made him dirty. The cloth had stains, but that didn't define the cloth's essential nature. It just meant the cloth needed washing. Similarly, having attachment arise in your mind doesn't make you an attached person. It means attachment is a pattern that arises, and with awareness and practice, that pattern can be transformed. As the Buddha washed the cloth while teaching Rahula, he demonstrated something important. Purification isn't violent. He didn't scrub the cloth aggressively or try to destroy it to remove the stains. He washed it gently but thoroughly with water and soap, allowing the impurities to release naturally. The same is true for attachment in the mind. You don't purify attachment through force or self-criticism or harsh discipline. You purify it through patient awareness, seeing it clearly again and again, understanding its nature, not feeding it with new grasping, allowing it to be seen fully until it naturally releases. This is why the Buddha emphasized seeing as the first step. You cannot transform what you do not see. You cannot release what you deny. You cannot purify what you refuse to acknowledge is there. When someone doesn't choose you and you're suffering from attachment to them, the practice begins with simple, honest, non-judgmental seeing. Right now, I am grasping. Right now, my mind is reaching for what isn't available. Right now, I am creating suffering by insisting reality be different from what it is. That seeing, clear, direct, without story or judgment, is itself the beginning of transformation. Not because seeing immediately makes the attachment disappear, but because seeing allows you to have a different relationship with it. You're no longer unconsciously driven by it. You're aware of it, and in that awareness, you have choice, not about whether it arises, but about whether you feed it, believe it, or identify with it. The Buddha finished washing the cloth and showed it to Rahula, now clean. "Do you see?" he asked. The cloth is the same cloth, but the stains are gone. This is what happens through practice. Not that you become a different person, but that the impurities that cause suffering are gradually purified through seeing them clearly. When you practice awareness with attachment, when you see it arising, see it in your body, see it in your thoughts, see its impermanence, see the conditions that trigger it, see the space between you and it. You're doing what the Buddha taught Rahula. You're washing the cloth, not through force, not through denial, not through spiritual bypassing or positive thinking. Through clear seeing, patient awareness, and the understanding that transformation happens not by fighting what's present, but by seeing it so clearly that it can finally release. This is the practice of awareness. This is how you see attachment as it arises. This is the foundation of freedom from the suffering that comes when someone doesn't choose you. And it begins, always, with the willingness to see the stain on the cloth, not as judgment, not as failure, but as the first essential step toward purification. There was once an ascetic named Bahia Daruchirya who lived alone on the edge of the ocean, practicing meditation with such dedication that people began to revere him as enlightened. Bahia himself believed this. He thought he had reached the highest attainment, that his practice was complete, that he had nothing more to learn. But one night, devas, celestial beings who could see truth more clearly than humans, appeared to him and said, "Bahia, you are not enlightened. You have attained deep concentration, but you have not seen the ultimate truth. There is a teacher in Savatthi, the Buddha, who can show you what you have not yet seen. Go to him quickly." Bahia was shaken. Everything he believed about himself, about his attainment, was suddenly in question. He left immediately, traveling overnight, driven by an urgency he couldn't explain. By morning, he arrived in Savatthi and learned the Buddha was walking through the town on arms round, collecting food for his daily meal. Bahia ran to find him. When he saw the Buddha walking calmly down the street, Bahia threw himself at the Buddha's feet and begged, "Please, teach me the Dhamma so that I may find peace and liberation." The Buddha said gently, "This is not the time, Bahia. I am on alms round. Come to the monastery later." But Bahia, feeling the Deva's urgency in his bones, pleaded again, "Venerable sir, life is uncertain. Death could come for you or for me at any moment. Please teach me now." He asked 3 times, and finally, the Buddha stopped and looked at him. Then, the Buddha spoke what would become one of the most concise and profound teachings in all of Buddhism. In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, there is only the heard. In the sensed, there is only the sensed. In the cognized, there is only the cognized. When for you there is in the seen only the seen, in the heard only the heard, in the sensed only the sensed, in the cognized only the cognized, then you will not be by that. When you are not by that, you will not be in that. When you are not in that, you will be neither here, nor beyond, nor between the two. This, just this, is the end of suffering. In that moment, hearing those words, understanding their meaning, Baha'ya became fully enlightened. He saw through the illusion of permanent self, through the grasping that creates suffering, through the fundamental delusion that had kept him bound. In an instant, he was free. Baha'ya bowed to the Buddha in gratitude and turned to leave. Within moments, literally moments after achieving enlightenment, Baha'ya was gored by a cow and died on the spot. Later, when the monks found his body and asked the Buddha about Baha'ya's fate, the Buddha told them, Baha'ya has attained final liberation. He died fully awakened. Then the Buddha said something that reveals the heart of his teaching. Life is uncertain. Death is certain. Baha'ya understood this, which is why he insisted, I teach him immediately. In the span of perhaps an hour, Baha'ya went from believing himself enlightened to discovering he wasn't, from seeking teaching to receiving it, from achieving enlightenment to dying. Birth, transformation, death, all in one morning. This is the teaching on impermanence that changes everything. Impermanence, anicca in Pali, is one of the three fundamental characteristics of all existence in Buddhism. Everything that arises passes away. Everything that comes together falls apart. Everything that is born dies. Everything that begins ends. This isn't pessimism. This isn't nihilism. This is simply accurate description of how reality works. Baha'ya's story demonstrates this with stark clarity. His belief in his own enlightenment was impermanent. It arose and passed. His seeking was impermanent. It arose and passed. His enlightenment was impermanent in form, though the liberation it brought was beyond arising and passing. His life was impermanent. It arose and passed. Nothing stayed. Everything changed. And this is true for every single experience, every single moment, every single thing that exists in conditioned reality. When someone doesn't choose you, you're experiencing impermanence directly. Their feelings changed or never solidified in the way you hoped. The connection you imagined didn't remain or didn't manifest. The future you were building in your mind dissolved before it ever became real. This hurts. The pain of impermanence is real pain. But here's what the Buddha taught. Suffering doesn't come from impermanence itself. Suffering comes from relating to impermanent things as if they were permanent. You suffer because you took someone's interest or your hope for their interest and treated it as solid, unchanging, dependable. You built on it as if it were stable ground. You organized your sense of future around it as if it would last. And when it changed, which is what impermanent things always do, you experienced that change as betrayal, as loss, as evidence that something is wrong with you or with reality itself. But nothing was wrong. Things simply changed because change is their nature. The Buddha taught that there are 3 kinds of suffering, and understanding impermanence addresses all 3. The first kind is the suffering of painful experiences, the direct pain of loss, rejection, disappointment. This suffering is unavoidable as long as you're alive and capable of feeling. When someone doesn't choose you, there's pain. You wanted connection and didn't get it. You hoped for reciprocation and received rejection instead. This pain is real and valid. The second kind is the suffering of change, the unsatisfactory nature of pleasant experiences because they don't last. Even when someone does choose you, that choosing is impermanent. Feelings change, circumstances shift. People grow in different directions. The initial spark doesn't maintain the same intensity. The certainty of early connection gives way to the complexity of long-term relationship. Nothing stays in its initial form. Everything that arises is already in the process of changing. The third kind of suffering is the deepest, the suffering inherent in clinging to conditioned existence itself. This is the suffering that comes from making peace conditional on impermanent things, on someone choosing you, on circumstances aligning perfectly, on getting what you want and keeping it forever. When you make your peace dependent on something impermanent, you've guaranteed suffering, because impermanent things will change and your peace will crumble with them. Bahia's story shows the alternative. In his final teaching, the Buddha pointed Bahia towards seeing things as they are, just hearing in the hearing, just seeing in the seeing, just sensing in the sensing, without adding the story of me and mine and permanent on top of it. When you see clearly that everything is impermanent, something profound shifts in how you relate to experience. You stop demanding that impermanent things stay permanent. You stop being surprised when things change. You stop making change into evidence of failure or wrongness. You start meeting each moment as it is, knowing it will pass, allowing it to pass, without grasping or pushing away. This doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you stop torturing yourself by insisting that changing things stop changing. When someone doesn't choose you, impermanence is operating. Maybe their interest was genuine but temporary. It arose and passed, as impermanent things do. Maybe your compatibility changed as you both changed, which is what impermanent beings inevitably do. Maybe the circumstances that might have supported connection shifted, as circumstances always shift. None of this makes the pain less real, but understanding impermanence changes your relationship to the pain. You stop asking, "Why did this change?" because you understand that change is the nature of all conditioned things. Change doesn't need a reason. Unchanging would need a reason, would be the anomaly. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me that they didn't stay interested?" because you understand that interest, like everything else, is impermanent. Their interest changing isn't about your worth any more than seasons changing is about the Earth's worth. You stop asking, "How do I make them choose me?" because you understand that you cannot make impermanent things permanent through force of will or strategic behavior. Impermanence is liberation disguised as loss. It's liberation because when you truly understand that everything changes, you stop building your peace on things that will inevitably change. You stop making your happiness conditional on someone choosing you, staying with you, feeling about you tomorrow, what they felt yesterday. You start finding peace in what doesn't change, not external circumstances, which are always changing, but in the capacity to be present with whatever is arising, including change itself. Bahia demonstrated something else crucial. Even death, the ultimate change, couldn't touch the liberation he found through understanding. He became enlightened and died within the same hour, but his enlightenment was complete. He didn't need time to consolidate it or protect it or make sure it lasted. Because enlightenment isn't about making any particular state permanent. It's about seeing clearly that no state is permanent and finding freedom in that seeing rather than suffering. When you're not chosen, you're being given a teaching on impermanence, whether you wanted it or not. You're learning directly that connections change, that interest shifts, that what felt solid can become uncertain, that futures you imagined can dissolve before manifesting. You can relate to this teaching with resistance, fighting the impermanence, demanding reality be different, making the change into evidence of cosmic injustice or personal unworthiness. Or you can relate to it with wisdom, recognizing that you're experiencing the fundamental nature of conditioned existence, that this pain is teaching you not to build on shifting ground, that understanding impermanence is understanding freedom. The Buddha's final words to his disciples, spoken as he was dying, were about impermanence. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. He didn't say this to depress them or make them afraid. He said it to free them from the suffering that comes from denying or fighting what is fundamentally true. Everything changes. This person's feelings changed or never formed as you hoped. This connection shifted or ended or never fully began. That change isn't personal. It isn't punishment. It isn't evidence that something is wrong with you or with how reality operates. It's just impermanence, doing what impermanence always does, manifesting as change. And when you stop arguing with impermanence, when you stop demanding that changing things stay unchanged, when you stop making your peace conditional on permanence in an impermanent world, you find something that doesn't change. Not external stability. That's impossible in conditioned existence. But internal stability, the capacity to meet whatever arises, including change and loss, without being destroyed by it. Bahia found this in an instant and died free. You might take longer, moving through the pain slowly, learning gradually what he learned in a flash. But the teaching is the same. Everything changes, and understanding that truth is the end of suffering, not the cause of it. When you truly understand impermanence, you stop trying to make people permanent fixtures in your life. You appreciate them while they're present, knowing presence is temporary. You value connection without demanding it stay exactly as it is forever. And when someone doesn't choose you, you grieve the loss without making it mean something permanent about your worth or your future. Because in an impermanent world, this too will change. This pain will change. Your circumstances will change. Your understanding will deepen. New possibilities will arise. Not because you deserve it or earned it, but simply because change is the nature of all things. And that nature, that fundamental impermanence, is not your enemy. It's your teacher. It's showing you where you're building on unstable ground, so you can learn to find stability in what doesn't need external conditions to remain whole. This is the teaching that changes everything, not the content of what happens, but your relationship to change itself. "7 days after the Buddha's enlightenment, he gave his first teaching to 5 ascetics in the Deer Park at Isipatana. That teaching on the 4 Noble Truths became famous, known as turning the wheel of the Dharma. But 5 days later, the Buddha gave a second teaching to the same 5 ascetics that was equally profound, though less famous. He taught them about the 5 aggregates, the components that humans mistake for a permanent, unchanging self. The Buddha asked them to examine their direct experience. Is the body permanent or impermanent? The ascetics answered, "Impermanent, Venerable Sir." And what is impermanent? Is that satisfactory or unsatisfactory? Unsatisfactory, Venerable Sir. And what is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and subject to change? Is it fitting to regard that as, this is mine, this I am, this is myself? No, Venerable Sir. The Buddha then went through each aggregate systematically: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. For each one, the same questions, the same recognitions: impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. He showed them that what they'd been calling I and me and mine was actually a constantly changing stream of processes, a body that's always aging and dying and replacing cells, feelings that arise and pass moment by moment, perceptions that shift with conditions, mental formations that come and go, consciousness that flickers in and out with every sense contact. None of it was stable. None of it was under their control. None of it was a permanent self that could be grasped or protected or enhanced or diminished. The Buddha concluded, when you see this clearly, you become disenchanted with form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with mental formations, disenchanted with consciousness. Being disenchanted, you become dispassionate. Through dispassion, you are liberated. Upon hearing this teaching, all 5 ascetics became fully enlightened. They saw through the illusion of a permanent self, and in that seeing, they were free. This teaching, known as anatta, or not self, is perhaps the most radical and misunderstood teaching in all of Buddhism. And it has everything to do with why you suffer when someone doesn't choose you. When someone doesn't choose you, who exactly is not being chosen? You might answer, me, myself, who I am. But the Buddha's teaching on the 5 aggregates asks you to look more carefully. Is it your body that's not being chosen? Your body is constantly changing. The cells that compose it now are not the same cells that composed it a year ago. Which version of your body wasn't chosen? Yesterday's, today's, tomorrow's? Is it your feelings that aren't being chosen? Feelings arise and pass moment by moment. Right now you might feel rejected, but an hour ago you felt fine, and an hour from now you might feel different again. Which feeling is the you that wasn't chosen? Is it your perceptions, your ideas about yourself, your self-image? Those shift constantly based on circumstances, feedback, mood, the stories you're telling yourself. Are you the confident person you were last week, or the insecure person you are today? Which one wasn't chosen? Is it your mental formations, your habits, patterns, tendencies? Those are conditioned, learned, changing. They're not a fixed self, but processes that arise based on causes and conditions. Is it your consciousness, your awareness? Consciousness depends on sense contact to arise. It appears when there's an eye and a form, an ear and a sound, a mind and a thought. Without contact, there's no consciousness. It's not a thing you possess. It's a process that arises and ceases moment by moment. The Buddha's teaching is that when you examine your direct experience carefully, you cannot find a permanent, unchanging self that could be chosen or not chosen, accepted or rejected, validated or invalidated. There's no solid you at the center of experience. There's just experience arising and passing, sensations, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, all flowing, all changing, none of it fixed or graspable as mine. This might sound abstract or philosophical, but it has profound practical implications for suffering. When someone doesn't choose you, the suffering comes from believing there's a fixed self that has been evaluated and found lacking. You take their decision and make it into a verdict about who you fundamentally are. You solidify yourself into a permanent identity as the person who wasn't chosen, the person who isn't enough, the person who always gets rejected. But the Buddha's teaching reveals this as delusion. There's no permanent you to make verdicts about. There's just this constantly changing stream of experience. And right now, part of that stream includes the pain of not being chosen. The pain is real. But the story that this pain reveals something fixed and true about a permanent self, that's the delusion that creates suffering. Think about how you relate to rejection. Most people don't just feel the natural disappointment of not getting what they wanted. They take the rejection and build an entire identity around it. They say, "I'm not attractive enough," as if attractiveness is a fixed quality rather than something that shifts based on countless conditions, including the preferences and state of mind of the other person. They say, "I'm not interesting enough," as if interestingness is an inherent trait rather than something that emerges or doesn't emerge in the space between two people at a particular time. They say, "I'm not worthy of love," as if worthiness is something that can be permanently present or absent, rather than a concept you're projecting onto the flowing stream of experience. All of these statements treat the self as a fixed thing that can be evaluated, judged, and found deficient. But the Buddha taught the opposite. There is no fixed thing to evaluate. There are aggregates constantly arising and passing. Sometimes those aggregates appear in ways that align with what someone else is seeking, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the conditions support connection, and sometimes they don't. None of this says anything permanent about a permanent you, because there is no permanent you to say things about. This teaching is liberating because it dissolves the entire framework of needing to be chosen as validation of self-worth. If there's no permanent self, there's no permanent self that needs validation. If there's no fixed you, there's no fixed you that can be fundamentally rejected. If you're a constantly changing process rather than a static entity, then someone not choosing you says nothing about your essence, because you don't have an essence. You have a stream of changing conditions. The Buddha emphasized that seeing not self doesn't mean you disappear or become nothing or lose all sense of conventional identity. You still function in the world. You still have preferences, make choices, engage in relationships. You still use I and me as convenient designations for this particular stream of experience. But you stop believing in a solid, permanent, findable self that those designations point to. And in that stopping, you're free from the suffering that comes from defending, enhancing, or mourning a self that never existed in the first place. When the Buddha taught the 5 aggregates to the 5 ascetics, he was showing them something they could verify in their own experience. He wasn't asking them to believe in a philosophy or accept a doctrine. He was asking them to look carefully at their actual experience and see what's really there. You can do the same investigation right now. When you think, "I wasn't chosen," try to find the I that wasn't chosen. Is it a thought arising in awareness? Then it's impermanent. It arises and passes. Is it a feeling in your body? Then it's constantly changing. The sensations shift moment by moment. Is it a mental image of yourself? Then it's a perception, constructed from memory and imagination, not a solid thing. When you actually look for this solid self that was rejected, you can't find it. You find thoughts about self, feelings about self, perceptions of self, but you don't find a self itself. This isn't a conceptual game. This is direct investigation of what's actually present in your experience. And when you see clearly that there's no fixed self to be rejected, something profound shifts. The wound of not being chosen begins to heal because you realize there was never anyone solid enough to be wounded in the way you thought. There's pain. Yes, that's present. There's disappointment. That arises. There's sadness about loss of possibility. That's real. But there's no damaged self, no fundamentally rejected you, no permanent identity as not enough. Those are stories added on top of the direct experience, and they're stories built on the false foundation of believing in a permanent self. The Buddha taught that clinging to the 5 aggregates as self is the root of suffering. When you cling to form as self, you suffer when your body ages, changes, becomes ill. When you cling to feelings as self, you suffer when pleasant feelings pass and unpleasant ones arise. When you cling to perceptions as self, you suffer when your self-image is challenged or when you can't maintain the identity you've constructed. When you cling to mental formations as self, you suffer when your habits and patterns don't serve you, but you can't let them go because you think they're who you are. When you cling to consciousness as self, you suffer because consciousness depends on conditions, and you can never fully control those conditions. All of this clinging to aggregates as self creates the suffering of needing to be chosen, because if these aggregates are me, then someone not choosing them is rejecting me. But when you see clearly that the aggregates are not self, that there's no owner of experience, but just experience arising and passing, the whole framework collapses. Someone not choosing you becomes simply this: certain conditions didn't align, certain processes didn't sync up, certain preferences and circumstances and timing didn't create the connection you hoped for. None of it personal in the way you thought, because there's no permanent person for it to be personal about. The Buddha called this teaching hard to see, because it goes against the most fundamental assumption humans carry, that there's a real, permanent me at the center of experience. You've been operating from this assumption your entire life. Every thought starts with, I think every feeling is my feeling. Every experience is happening to me. The language itself reinforces the illusion of a separate, permanent self. But the Buddha was asking the 5 ascetics, and is asking you to look beyond language and belief to direct experience. What's actually here when you look carefully? Changing sensations, arising thoughts, passing emotions, constructed perceptions, all flowing, None of it solid, none of it owned by a permanent self that exists apart from the flow. This seeing is what liberated the 5 ascetics. In one teaching, they went from belief in a solid self to recognition of not self, and that recognition freed them from the suffering that comes from trying to defend and enhance and validate something that doesn't exist in the way they thought. When someone doesn't choose you and you're suffering, you have the same opportunity those ascetics had. You can continue believing in a permanent self that has been evaluated and rejected, that needs to be fixed or improved or made worthy of choosing. Or you can investigate, where is this self that needs choosing? Not as a philosophical question, but as a direct inquiry into your present experience. And when you look carefully and honestly, you discover what the Buddha taught. There's no one there to reject. There's just this moment's experience, this sensation, this thought, this emotion, arising from countless conditions and passing away into countless more. The pain doesn't immediately disappear when you see this. The disappointment doesn't vanish. The sadness about loss may still arise. But the suffering, the deep existential wound of believing you as a permanent entity, have been found unworthy. That begins to dissolve. Because when there's no permanent you, there's no permanent you that can be fundamentally unworthy. There's just this stream of experience, sometimes flowing toward connection, and sometimes flowing away from it, sometimes meeting another stream in confluence, and sometimes not. None of it a verdict on a self that doesn't exist in the solid, permanent way you've been believing it does. This is the most radical teaching in Buddhism. The one who needs to be chosen is a fiction. Not a fiction you consciously created, but one built from habit and conditioning and the deep-rooted human tendency to solidify the flowing stream of experience into a graspable me. And the path to freedom is seeing through that fiction directly, not by believing the teaching, but by investigating your experience until you see it for yourself. When you see it clearly, as the 5 ascetics did in hearing the Buddha's teaching on the aggregates, the whole framework of needing to be chosen to validate your worth collapses. Not because you've convinced yourself you don't need validation, but because you've seen directly that there's no permanent self there to validate. And that seeing, clear, direct, unshakable, is liberation from the suffering of not being chosen. There was a wealthy householder named Chitta who lived in a small town and was known for his deep understanding of the Dhamma. Though he wasn't a monk, Chitta's wisdom was so clear that even senior monks would seek him out for discussion and guidance. He was generous with his home, regularly inviting monks to teach the townspeople and offering meals and support to the Sangha. One day, a group of monks arrived in town, and Chitta invited them to his home, as was his practice. He prepared a meal, gathered the community, and asked the monks to share the Dhamma. But these monks were arrogant. They spoke down to Chitta, dismissed his questions as beneath them, and treated him with barely concealed contempt because he was a layperson rather than an ordained monk. When Chitta offered corrections to their misunderstandings of the teachings, corrections that were accurate and rooted in deep study, the monks became defensive and dismissive. They implied that a householder had no place teaching monks anything, regardless of his understanding. Chitta listened calmly. He didn't argue or defend himself. He didn't try to prove his worth or change their minds. When the meal was finished, he thanked them politely for coming, and then he simply stopped inviting them. There were no speeches about disrespect, no explanations about why they were no longer welcome, no attempts to make them understand what they'd done wrong. Chitta continued his practice of supporting the Sangha, but he directed his invitations and support toward monks who engaged with respect and genuine interest in the Dhamma. When the disrespectful monks asked why they were no longer invited, Chitta responded simply, "I honor the Dhamma by supporting those who embody it." Later, when the Buddha heard about this situation, he praised Chitta's response. The Buddha said that Chitta had acted with perfect right action, one of the essential elements of the Eightfold Path. He hadn't been cruel or vindictive, but he also hadn't continued participating in a dynamic that dishonored both himself and the teachings. This story reveals something essential about what right action means when someone doesn't choose you or doesn't treat you with respect. Right action isn't about forcing others to behave differently. It's about choosing how you participate or don't participate based on what aligns with wisdom and compassion. When someone doesn't choose you, right action begins with a simple recognition. You cannot control their choice, but you can control your response. You cannot make someone choose you through persuasion, manipulation, or self-improvement projects designed to become who you think they want. You cannot force interest where it doesn't exist. You cannot create reciprocity through sheer force of will. What you can do is choose how you relate to the reality of not being chosen. Chitta didn't try to make the disrespectful monks respect him. He didn't continue inviting them while hoping they would change. He didn't diminish himself to make them comfortable or work harder to prove his worthiness of their regard. He simply redirected his energy toward what was reciprocal and respectful. This is right action, aligning your behavior with reality rather than with fantasy, with wisdom rather than with wishful thinking. In Buddhist teaching, right action is part of the ethical conduct section of the Eightfold Path, along with right speech and right livelihood. Together, these three elements guide how you move through the world in ways that reduce suffering rather than create it. Right action specifically addresses physical and behavioral choices, what you do, not just what you say or think. The traditional definition focuses on abstaining from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. But the principle extends to all actions. Are your behaviors creating suffering or reducing it? When someone doesn't choose you and you keep chasing them, offering more of yourself, trying to convince them, waiting for them to change their mind, what kind of suffering are you creating? You're creating suffering for yourself through continued rejection and the erosion of your self-respect. You're potentially creating discomfort for them through pressure they didn't ask for. You're creating a dynamic that dishonors what the Buddha taught about accepting reality as it is. Right action in this situation means stopping your participation in what creates suffering. Like Sita, you don't need to make a dramatic exit or deliver a speech about your worth or explain why you're withdrawing. You simply stop offering yourself where you're not received. This isn't punishment. This isn't revenge. This is alignment with reality. Chitta didn't stop inviting the disrespectful monks to punish them or to teach them a lesson. He stopped inviting them because continuing to invite them would have meant continuing to participate in disrespect toward himself and toward the Dhamma he honored. When you stop chasing someone who doesn't choose you, you're not punishing them. You're honoring yourself and honoring the truth of the situation. Right action also requires discernment about what behavior actually serves the Dhamma versus what serves ego. There's a difference between withdrawing from self-respect and withdrawing from wounded pride. Self-respect says, "This dynamic doesn't serve me, so I'm choosing to step back." Wounded pride says, "I'll show them they were wrong, not to choose me, by making myself unavailable." Self-respect is quiet and clear. Wounded pride is performative and reactive. Chitta's response came from self-respect. He didn't need the monks to know they'd hurt him or to regret their behavior. He simply stopped participating in what didn't align with mutual respect. When you choose right action after not being chosen, check your motivation. Are you withdrawing because continuing creates suffering and dishonors your dignity? Or are you withdrawing to prove a point to make them sorry, to demonstrate your value through absence. The first is right action. The second is ego, trying to control through different means. Right action also involves compassion, not just for yourself, but for the other person. Sitta's withdrawal wasn't vengeful. He didn't speak badly about the monks or try to turn others against them. He simply redirected his energy toward what served the Dhamma more fully. When someone doesn't choose you, compassion recognizes that they're acting from their own conditioning, their own capacity, their own karma. Their choice not to choose you isn't necessarily about malice or cruelty. It's about where they are, what they can see, what they're capable of in this moment. Compassion doesn't require you to keep offering yourself to them. It just means you don't make them wrong for being who they are and seeing what they see. You can have compassion for their limitations, while also having enough self-compassion to step back from a dynamic that hurts you. These two things are not in conflict. In fact, they work together. The Buddha praised Chitta specifically because his response embodied both wisdom and compassion. He didn't harm the monks through his withdrawal, and he didn't harm himself through continued participation in disrespect. Right action means finding the middle way, not aggression toward those who don't choose you, and not self-abandonment in pursuit of them. In practical terms, right action, after not being chosen, looks like this. You stop the behaviors that perpetuate grasping. You stop checking if they've messaged when you know they haven't. You stop crafting perfect texts designed to spark their interest. You stop showing up in spaces hoping they'll notice you. You stop offering help they didn't ask for or creating reasons to stay in contact. None of this is dramatic or hostile. It's simply stopping the actions that create suffering while pretending they might create connection. Right action also means you don't replace grasping behaviors with passive-aggressive ones. You don't post things on social media designed to make them regret not choosing you. You don't try to make them jealous or demonstrate how well you're doing without them. You don't fish for information about them through mutual friends. All of that is still grasping, just with a different strategy. Right action is clean withdrawal. No hidden agendas, no manipulation through absence, just honest stepping back from what doesn't serve wisdom or compassion. The Buddha taught that right action naturally arises from right view and right intention. When you see clearly that chasing what doesn't choose you creates suffering, right view. And when your intention is to reduce suffering rather than feed ego, right intention, then right action becomes obvious. You don't need complicated rules about what to do or not do. You simply act from clarity and compassion, and the appropriate response emerges naturally. Chitta didn't need the Buddha to tell him to stop inviting disrespectful monks. He saw clearly that continuing would dishonor both himself and the Dhamma, and that clarity led directly to appropriate action. When you see clearly that someone has not chosen you, and that continuing to pursue them creates suffering, right action becomes clear too. You stop pursuing, not with fanfare, not with explanation, not with hurt feelings weaponized into distance, just with quiet, dignified withdrawal from what doesn't serve you or them. Sometimes people worry that this makes them cold or unloving, or gives up too easily. But the Buddha's teaching on right action isn't about coldness or premature giving up. It's about honoring reality and acting from wisdom rather than from delusion. If someone genuinely needs time or space to figure out their feelings, right action might look like giving them that space without pressure. If someone is clearly uninterested and you're inventing reasons to stay hopeful, right action looks like accepting what they've shown you and stepping back. The difference isn't in the action itself, but in the clarity with which you perceive the situation. Chitta knew the monks were being disrespectful. It wasn't ambiguous or uncertain. His action arose from that clarity. When someone doesn't choose you, usually the reality is clear too, clearer than you want to admit, because admitting it means feeling the pain of loss. But right action requires that you base your behavior on what's true, rather than on what you wish were true. The Buddha also taught that right action includes what you do for yourself, not just how you relate to others. After Citta stopped inviting the disrespectful monks, he didn't just create empty space. He actively invited and supported monks who engaged with respect and genuine Dhamma practice. When you stop chasing someone who doesn't choose you, right action means you don't just create a void. You direct your energy toward what nourishes you, toward friendships, toward practice, toward activities that bring genuine joy, toward people who do choose you and appreciate your presence. This isn't about replacing one person with another or proving you're fine without them. It's about recognizing that your energy is precious and directing it toward what actually serves your well-being and growth. Right action means you stop betraying yourself in pursuit of external validation. You stop diminishing yourself to be more acceptable. You stop apologizing for wanting reciprocal connection. You stop participating in dynamics where your dignity is optional. Like Citta, you honor the Dhamma by living in alignment with it, even when that means walking away from what doesn't honor you in return. The teaching isn't that you never feel hurt or disappointed when someone doesn't choose you. The teaching is that you don't let hurt or disappointment drive you to act in ways that create more suffering. You feel the pain. You acknowledge the loss, and then you act from wisdom and compassion rather than from desperation or denial. That's right action. That's the path the Buddha praised in Citta's response. That's what dignity and compassion look like when translated into behavior. You don't need speeches or confrontations or explanations. You simply stop participating in what doesn't serve, and you direct your energy toward what does. Quietly, clearly, with both compassion for others and respect for yourself. This is how you walk the path with integrity when someone doesn't choose you, not through force or manipulation, not through self-abandonment or bitterness, but through right action that honors both reality and your own dignity. There was a woman named Patakara whose story contains such devastating loss that it seems almost unbearable to tell. In the span of one day, Patakara lost her husband to a snake bite, watched her infant child carried off by a hawk, saw her older child drown in a swollen river, and arrived at her parents' home to learn that their house had collapsed in a storm, killing her mother, father, and brother. Everyone she loved, gone in a single day. The grief shattered her mind completely. She tore off her clothes and wandered naked through the streets, weeping and wailing, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. One day, still wandering, she came upon the Buddha teaching in a grove. He looked at her and spoke directly. "Sister, regain your presence of mind." Something in his voice reached her through the fog. She looked down, realized she was naked, and someone gave her a cloth to cover herself. Then she collapsed before the Buddha and told him everything. The Buddha didn't try to explain it away or offer platitudes. He said simply, "You search for your children, your husband, your parents, but you should rather search for yourself." Then he taught her about impermanence, that everything that arises must pass away, that birth contains death, that meeting contains parting, that form contains dissolution. This isn't punishment. This is the nature of all conditioned existence. Something in Patakara understood this, at a depth beyond words. She'd been trying to hold on to people who were always temporary, building her entire sense of safety on things that were never permanent. She became a nun that day and practiced deeply. The texts say that one evening, washing her feet, she watched the water flowing away and saw in it the entire teaching on impermanence. The first water flowed and disappeared. The second water flowed and disappeared. The third water flowed and disappeared. Everything arising and passing, nothing staying, nothing solid. In that moment, She became fully enlightened, completely liberated from suffering. Not because her pain disappeared, or because she forgot her losses, but because she understood the nature of all loss so completely that she stopped fighting impermanence and started meeting it with wisdom. When someone doesn't choose you, and you let go of your grasping after them, peace arrives in a similar way to how it arrived for Patakara. Not because the pain of not being chosen disappears, but because you stop creating additional suffering by arguing with reality. Peace means the internal war has ended. You're no longer fighting with what is, no longer insisting that reality should have been different, no longer creating elaborate narratives about what it means that you weren't chosen. You simply recognize, this is what happened, this is what's real, and I can meet it without shattering. The Buddha taught that peace is the natural state of mind when the causes of suffering are not present. Peace isn't something you achieve or attain. Peace is what remains when you stop creating the conditions that disturb it. Patakara's peace didn't come from her circumstances improving. Her family was still dead. The grief was still present. But she'd stopped fighting the impermanence that made those losses inevitable. And in that stopping, peace was there, not as a feeling of happiness, but as a deep settledness, a fundamental okayness, even in the presence of pain. But understanding peace and knowing how to walk toward it are two different things. This is where another teaching becomes essential, a teaching about when walking away is the wisest response. In the town of Kosambi, a dispute arose among monks that escalated beyond all reason. The argument was about a minor rule violation, something inconsequential, but the monks split into factions, each insisting they were right and the other side was wrong. They stopped speaking to each other, except to argue. They refused to compromise or listen, or consider that perhaps both sides were missing something more important than being right. The Buddha, hearing about this dispute, traveled to Kosambi to help them reconcile. He arrived and tried to mediate, speaking about harmony, about the importance of unity in practice, about letting go of righteousness for the sake of peace. The monks barely listened. They were so absorbed in their positions, so convinced of their correctness, that even the Buddha's presence couldn't penetrate their stubbornness. So the Buddha did something unexpected. He stopped trying to convince them. He said simply, "You are acting like fools, unable to live together in harmony. I will leave you to your quarrel." And he walked away. He went alone into the forest and stayed there, practicing in solitude, at peace, in a way he couldn't be, while trying to force reconciliation, where reconciliation wasn't ready to happen. The monks left to their quarreling, eventually exhausted themselves. The lay people, disgusted by the dispute, stopped supporting them. Gradually, the monks began to see what their stubbornness had cost them, not just material support, but the very peace they'd ordained to find. They went to the forest, found the Buddha, and begged his forgiveness. They'd been so busy being right that they'd forgotten what actually mattered. The Buddha returned with them, but the teaching had been delivered. Sometimes the wisest response is to step away peacefully from what cannot be forced. When someone doesn't choose you, you're facing the same choice the Buddha faced at Kosambi. You can keep trying to make them see your value. Keep offering yourself hoping they'll finally receive you. Keep explaining and pursuing and waiting for them to change their mind. Or you can recognize, as the Buddha did, that some things cannot be forced. Not connection, not understanding, not someone choosing you when they're not ready or willing or able. Walking away isn't giving up. It isn't admitting defeat. It's recognizing reality and responding with wisdom rather than with insistence. The Buddha didn't walk away from the monks because he stopped caring about them. He walked away because staying meant participating in dysfunction that he couldn't fix through his presence alone. When you walk away from someone who doesn't choose you, you're doing the same thing. You're not abandoning hope for connection in your life. You're abandoning the specific hope that this particular person will choose you, because that hope is keeping you trapped in suffering. The Buddha's time in the forest wasn't punishment or isolation. It was peace. It was choosing his own well-being over forcing reconciliation that wasn't ready to happen. Your time after letting go won't be punishment either, even when it feels lonely or sad or uncertain. It's space. Space for healing, space for clarity, space for remembering who you are when you're not consumed by chasing someone who doesn't choose you. The teaching here is simple but profound. You came to these words carrying a wound, believing you needed to be chosen to be whole. Through 11 stories, from Vakali's physical attachment to the Buddha, to Nanda's craving, to the fire sermon's teaching on burning, to the crow dropping the meat, to Chana's transformation through solitude, to Rahula learning to see the stains, to Bahia's instant enlightenment and death, to the teaching on no-self through the 5 aggregates, to Chitta's dignified boundaries, to Patakara's peace, to the Buddha walking away from the quarrel at Kosambi, you've been shown the same truth from different angles. The suffering doesn't come from not being chosen. It comes from the grasping, from the insistence that reality be different, from the belief in a permanent self that needs external validation to be whole. When you see this clearly, really see it, not just understand it intellectually. And when you stop feeding the fires of attachment through your actions, something natural happens. The burning quiets. The grasping releases. The peace that was always there becomes obvious. This doesn't mean you never want connection again, or that you become immune to disappointment, or that relationships stop mattering. It means you stop making your peace conditional on being chosen. Like Patakara, you learn to meet impermanence with wisdom rather than resistance. Like the Buddha at Kosambi, you learn when walking away is the most compassionate response. The path forward isn't about finding someone who chooses you. The path forward is about understanding that you were never broken by not being chosen in the first place. You are whole now, in this moment, regardless of who chooses or doesn't choose you. That wholeness isn't something you create through spiritual practice, or positive thinking, or becoming a better version of yourself. It's what you discover when you stop obscuring it with grasping, with stories, with the belief that you need external validation to be enough. And once you discover it, once you see clearly that peace doesn't depend on being chosen, you're free in a way you've never been free before. Not free from ever feeling pain, but free from creating unnecessary suffering on top of inevitable pain. Not free from wanting connection, but free from making connection a condition for your inner peace. Not free from disappointment, but free from making disappointment into evidence about your fundamental worth. This is the liberation the Buddha taught, not transcendence of human experience, but wisdom in how you relate to it. You came here hurting because someone didn't choose you. You may still hurt when you finish reading these words. But if you've truly heard these teachings, you hurt differently now, with less resistance, with more space, with the understanding that this pain is teaching you something essential about where you've been building your peace and where peace actually lives. The Buddha ended his life with a teaching on impermanence. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence, not to frighten or discourage, but to free you from the suffering that comes from fighting what cannot be changed. This person didn't choose you. That reality won't change through hoping or grasping or becoming someone different. But your relationship to that reality can change. Your suffering over it can end. Your peace can emerge from underneath the grasping, whole and unbroken, exactly as it's always been. This is the teaching. This is the path. This is liberation through release. Not someday when you're healed, or when you find someone else, or when enough time has passed. Now, In this moment, when you finally stop fighting what is and start meeting reality with wisdom, with compassion, with the understanding that peace was never dependent on being chosen in the first place. The hand that was desperately clutching can open. The fire that was burning can quiet. The war with reality can end. And what remains when the grasping stops, when the burning ceases, when the war ends? Just this, peace, simple and natural, exactly as the Buddha promised it would be when you finally let go.